Most people believe aging slowly destroys the human body. Muscles shrink, bones weaken, energy fades. But what if much of that decline is not caused by aging at all? What if your body is simply responding to a signal you stopped sending years ago? Here's the question I have spent years sitting with. Archaeological records of people who lived 40, 50, 60 years in pre-modern environments show skeletal structures that look, in many ways, stronger than those of people in their 30s and 40s today. Not because they were exercising, not because they had gym memberships or personal trainers. In fact, they had no concept of exercise as a separate scheduled activity at all. And that absence, that gap between how they moved and how we move, is precisely the problem. Here's what almost no one tells you about aging and the human body. The deterioration most of us experience is not entirely the result of time passing. Much of it is the result of signals we stopped sending. Biological signals that your skeleton, your muscle tissue, and your nervous system are waiting for and have been waiting for every single day. Nearly 40% of adults over 60 in the United States live with significant loss of muscle mass and bone density, not because the body gave up on them, but because the body received a very specific message, repeated consistently over decades, and responded accordingly. I am Daniel Lieberman, Harvard professor and evolutionary biologist. I have spent my career studying how the human body evolved to run, eat, think, and survive. Now, I am here to help you understand why your ancient biology struggles in a radically modern world, and how to work with it instead of against it. Welcome to the evolution. If you find yourself thinking more carefully about your body after watching this, consider subscribing. This channel exists to give you the evolutionary science that most health conversations never reach. Okay. To understand what is happening to aging bodies today, we need to go back. Not to describe how our ancestors exercised. They did not exercise. But to understand something far more fundamental about how the human body was built to work and what it was built to require. For most of our species' history, survival depended on a delicate balance between movement and energy conservation. Calories were not guaranteed. They were uncertain, often scarce, and sometimes dangerously difficult to obtain. For a hunter-gatherer living 50,000 years ago, every calorie spent on unnecessary effort carried a real cost. Natural selection paid close attention to that cost. The result is a design that surprises many people. Humans evolved to be capable of extraordinary endurance, yet also deeply motivated to conserve energy whenever possible. That tension is not a contradiction. It is a strategy. Now consider what the human skeleton actually is. Your skeleton is not passive architecture. It is alive, it listens, and it constantly asks one question: is this body still being used? The technical term for what governs that question is Wolff's Law, named after a 19th century German surgeon who observed something striking. Imagine force passing through a bone. Load it, and it strengthens. Remove that load, and it withdraws. Bone forms and reforms in direct proportion to the mechanical forces placed upon it. Your skeleton is essentially waiting for instructions. Anthropologists studying contemporary foraging societies offer a useful window into what those instructions once looked like. Among Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, adults typically walk between 5 and 9 miles per day. But here is what they almost never do. They do not run laps, they do not perform workouts, they do not exercise for the sake of exercise. Movement in ancestral environments was purposeful, woven into daily survival tasks. Consider communities living on the coastal regions of pre-modern Peru. Researchers examining skeletal remains found bone mineral density measurements that modern sports scientists would associate with trained athletes. These were not warriors or performers. They were fishermen, gatherers, and farmers. Their bones were simply the product of a life that never stopped asking something of their bodies. And crucially, this continued into old age, because the work did not stop. The signals continued, and so the bones responded, and so the muscles adapted, and so the biology maintained. The moment those signals stop arriving, something else begins. Here is where things get strange. The moment those signals stop arriving, your body begins quietly dismantling itself. Not out of failure, not out of punishment, out of perfect evolutionary logic. The modern retired professional in Atlanta, the remote worker in London who moves between a desk and a couch, the 60-year-old caregiver in Sydney whose physical world has contracted to a house and a car, they are not aging badly because their biology is failing. They are aging rapidly because their biology is functioning exactly as it evolved to function. When the skeleton stops receiving mechanical load signals, it does not make a moral judgment. It simply reallocates resources. Bone tissue is metabolically expensive to maintain. If the body's sensory systems detect a sustained absence of load, no compression on the vertebrae, no tension on the long bones of the leg, it draws a very logical evolutionary conclusion. This load is no longer coming. Therefore, this tissue is no longer necessary. Therefore, the resources maintaining it can be redirected. In ancestral environments, this conclusion was almost never drawn, because almost no one lived in a condition of sustained load absence. Even in rest, ancestral populations used the ground. They crouched. They sat on uneven surfaces. They shifted position constantly. Modern sedentary life presents the biology with something it has almost no evolutionary preparation for: sustained mechanical silence. Hours in a chair, days of smooth floors and supportive footwear, weeks where the greatest physical challenge is a flight of stairs. Consider a woman in her mid-60s who worked for 30 years as a hospital administrator, desk-bound, commuting, sedentary evenings. After retirement, her world contracted further. She told her physician she felt her body had simply decided to age faster the moment she stopped working. Her bone density scans confirmed significant loss. Her muscle mass had declined. Her balance had deteriorated. She had not been sick. She had not made poor choices. She had simply lived in a world that quietly removed the mechanical conversation her biology depended on, and her body had responded with perfect evolutionary logic. And this raises a deeper question. If the body depends on mechanical signals to survive aging, why do most exercise programs fail to stop the decline? At this point, most people expect the answer to be simple. If modern life removes movement, the solution must be to add it back through exercise. Join a gym, follow a workout plan, push harder. But here is what the evolutionary story actually says. Exercise, the concept of scheduled physical activity for health benefits, is a genuinely modern idea. It did not exist in the form we recognize it for the vast majority of human history. And here's the critical problem this creates. When we reframe health as something achieved during those 30 to 60 dedicated minutes of structured activity, we absolve the other 23 hours of any biological responsibility. We treat the rest of life as a neutral backdrop. It is not. The body does not only receive mechanical signals during a morning jog or a gym session, it receives, or fails to receive, signals continuously. Every hour of sitting is not merely a neutral absence of exercise. It is an active message delivered to your skeletal and muscular biology, a message that says, the load is not coming. Withdraw. The human body does not primarily respond to short bursts of intense activity. It responds to repeated mechanical signals distributed across the day. Research comparing the sitting duration of office workers in Western countries to that of populations living in rural East Africa consistently shows something startling. The rural populations do sit, and they sit for comparable total hours, but they sit differently. They use ground-level postures. They shift frequently. They transition between squatting, kneeling, and low-seated positions. These postural variations maintain continuous low-level muscular and skeletal activation throughout the day. The chair, that foundational piece of modern furniture, removes this variation almost entirely. Consider a 55-year-old accountant who joins a gym and commits to running on a treadmill 3 evenings a week. For the first few weeks, motivation carries him forward, but gradually the sessions feel burdensome. After long days of cognitive work, the effort required to change clothes, travel to the gym, and push through structured exercise becomes difficult to sustain. Eventually, the routine fades. From a cultural perspective, this looks like a failure of discipline. From an evolutionary perspective, his body is responding logically. The activity feels disconnected from purpose, and that creates friction because the human brain evolved to resist discretionary energy expenditure when the demands of survival are already being met. This is not a character flaw. This is evolutionary economics. Let's step back for a moment. If you remember nothing else from this conversation, remember this: your skeleton and your muscles are not deteriorating because of age. They are deteriorating because the conversation has gone quiet. And the solution is not to schedule more time shouting. It is to restore the everyday language. The biological mechanism behind this insight is worth understanding at a deeper level. Inside your bones are tiny cells called osteocytes. Think of them as biological sensors. Their job is simple: detect mechanical stress. When they sense loading, they signal the osteoblasts, bone-building cells, to increase density and structural integrity. When loading is absent, they allow the osteoclasts, bone-resorbing cells, to break down and withdraw. This system evolved over millions of years in an environment where mechanical silence was almost never sustained. Bone can begin adapting to new mechanical demands in as little as 8 to 12 weeks under the right conditions, which means the system is not only capable of decline, it is equally capable of restoration. The same logic applies to skeletal muscle. The protein structures within muscle fibers are in constant flux, synthesizing and breaking down. What determines the net direction of that process is mechanical tension, particularly under load. Resistance, the experience of pulling or pushing against something that resists you, tips the balance toward synthesis. In its sustained absence, the balance tips toward breakdown. And here is something that makes all of this even more striking. NASA discovered this problem long before most aging researchers took it seriously. Astronauts returning from extended missions in microgravity would come back with the bone density and muscle mass of people decades older. Not because space aged them, because their biology had been running without the input signal it required. Astronauts in some extended missions can lose up to 1% of bone mass per month in microgravity. 6 months in orbit without that signal could produce skeletal changes that took years to partially reverse on the ground. What NASA learned through enormous effort and research expense is that the human body requires compression and tension to maintain itself. The spine needs axial loading. The hip needs impact. The long bones need bending forces. These are not stresses the body merely tolerates. They are inputs it depends on. The sedentary modern life, soft surfaces, smooth floors, climate-controlled interiors, digital work, and delivered food, has created for hundreds of millions of people something metabolically similar to what astronauts experience in orbit. Not as extreme, but operating on the same biological principle. The signals are absent, the biology responds accordingly, and the response, once understood clearly, stops feeling like failure. It starts feeling like exactly what it is, a logical biological outcome of a specific environmental input, an outcome that can be changed. Once we see movement through an evolutionary lens, a quiet shift begins to happen. The question changes. Instead of asking, how do I force myself to exercise? We begin asking something far more useful. How can I redesign my environment so that movement becomes normal again? This reflects how the human body actually evolved to function. Natural selection did not shape humans to rely on constant willpower. It shaped us to respond to the structure of our surroundings. This is what I call environment design over willpower, and it is rooted in solid evolutionary logic. Ancestral humans did not motivate themselves to be physically active. They lived in environments where physical activity was unavoidable. The genius of surviving aging is not discipline. It is structural. Consider what that looks like in practice. A retired teacher in her late 60s who redesigns her daily life so that walking is the default mode of errands, not exercise walks, purposeful walks. Her skeleton cannot tell the difference between a purposeful walk and a recreational one, but her brain, which evolved to conserve energy and resist arbitrary effort, responds very differently to movement with a destination than to movement for its own sake. Consider the 65-year-old man who replaces his chair with a standing desk and adds a low stool for variation, who gardens twice a week not for cardiovascular health but because his grandfather gardened, who carries his own groceries, who climbs stairs by default. None of these behaviors would qualify as exercise. All of them are delivering continuous mechanical signals to a biology that has been waiting for exactly this. Walking to nearby destinations rather than driving, using stairs instead of elevators, carrying groceries rather than relying exclusively on carts, standing or moving during phone calls, gardening, household tasks, or hobbies that involve lifting, digging, or building. Individually, these behaviors appear insignificant, but over months and years, they accumulate into thousands of small mechanical signals that maintain bone strength, muscle mass, joint mobility, and metabolic stability. Intensity is not always the missing ingredient. Consistency is. Many people approach movement with an all or nothing mindset. If they cannot commit to intense exercise several times a week, they conclude that the effort is not worthwhile. But evolution did not design the human body around occasional bursts of extreme exertion. It designed us for repeated, moderate effort spread across the day. This is one reason walking remains such a powerful behavior. Walking requires no specialized equipment. It imposes gentle mechanical loading on bones and joints. It activates large muscle groups. It improves circulation and metabolic function. But perhaps most importantly, walking aligns closely with the way humans historically moved through landscapes. For most of our species history, walking connected every part of daily life, finding food, maintaining social bonds, exploring territory, caring for family members. Movement had context. Movement had purpose. and the brain responded to purposeful movement with a completely different chemistry than it responds to movement that feels arbitrary. There is a related insight worth naming here, because it explains why so many structured exercise programs fail to hold. When exercise exists only as a separate, designated event, isolated from the rest of life, the brain treats it as an optional category, a task on a list, and when that task competes with fatigue, social obligation, weather, or simply the accumulated inertia of a busy day, it frequently loses, not because people are undisciplined, but because the brain evolved to resist discretionary energy expenditure when the demands of survival are already being met. What changes the equation is not stronger willpower. It is restructuring the environment so that mechanical demands are embedded in the fabric of ordinary life. A different neighborhood walkability, a standing surface for part of the day, stairs used by default rather than avoided, a habit of carrying rather than wheeling. These are not exercise substitutes. They are the restoration of an ecological context that exercise was invented to compensate for. The evolutionary insight here is ancient and simple. Bodies that were used continued to function. Bodies that were spared deteriorated, not because the spared body was broken, but because the biology interpreted stillness as a signal that maintenance was no longer required. There is one more dimension of this story that rarely enters the public conversation about aging, and it changes the stakes considerably. Skeletal muscle is not only a mechanical structure, it is a metabolic organ, and its role in how the body manages energy, blood glucose, inflammation, and even neurological function is far more central than most people appreciate. When muscle mass declines, which happens at a rate of roughly 3 to 5% per decade after midlife in sedentary individuals, something goes wrong that extends well beyond physical strength. The capacity for glucose clearance diminishes, metabolic flexibility decreases, inflammatory signaling within the body increases. Even cognitive function, which depends on a complex web of vascular health and neurochemical signaling, is affected by declining muscular activity. Research emerging from exercise physiology over the last 15 years has identified a class of molecules called myokines, signaling proteins released by contracting muscle tissue. These molecules communicate with the brain, the liver, the adipose tissue, and the immune system. They reduce systemic inflammation, they support neuroplasticity, they regulate appetite and fat metabolism, and they are only released when muscle tissue is actively working under load. This is an evolutionary system of extraordinary elegance. In ancestral environments, a physically active muscle was a reliable signal that the organism was healthy, engaged with its environment, and able to meet its demands. The body used that signal to regulate dozens of downstream systems. When the signal was strong, those systems were supported. When the signal went quiet, the regulatory support diminished. What this means for aging is significant. The loss of muscle mass is not merely a physical problem, it is a systemic regulatory problem, and the path through it is not motivational, it is mechanical. The body needs the signal, and the signal comes from loading muscle tissue against resistance, consistently, progressively, and with enough challenge to trigger adaptation. This does not require a gym. It does not require equipment. It requires gravity, resistance, and a body that is asked to do more than it finds comfortable, squatting to the floor and rising again, carrying something heavier than usual, pushing against something that pushes back. These are ancient physical conversations, and your biology is still fluent in them. Here is what makes this even more important to understand. What is remarkable and deeply underappreciated is that this mechanical responsiveness does not substantially diminish with age. Older bodies are not biologically incapable of maintaining or building tissue. The machinery remains functional. The challenge is simply that the input signal, the mechanical conversation, has often been absent for so long that the body is operating deep into a withdrawal state. Studies examining resistance training programs in adults over 70 consistently demonstrate this. Significant improvements in muscle mass, bone density, gait stability, and balance are achievable, not because the biology reversed its aging, but because the signals were finally restored. The body is not broken, it has simply been waiting in silence for a conversation that stopped arriving. And the moment you restore that conversation, even partially, even imperfectly, the response begins. I want to return to the question I posed at the beginning. If physical decline is written into our biology, if aging is simply what time does to a human body, why did it unfold so much more slowly in populations who lived so differently from us? The answer is that decline is not primarily written into the biology. It is written into the environment, into the years of mechanical silence that modern life so efficiently produces, into the absence of the signals that the skeleton and the muscle and the metabolic system evolved to depend on. The word exercise carries a kind of burden. It implies effort that is separate from life, effort that must be scheduled, forced, and sustained through willpower. And willpower, as every evolutionary biologist will tell you, is a fragile and unreliable mechanism for long-term behavior change. Natural selection did not design us to sustain behaviors through willpower. It designed us to sustain behaviors through environmental inevitability. The populations around the world who appear to age most successfully are not, in any uniform sense, exercising more. They are living in environments where the physical demands of daily life remain meaningfully present. Okinawan farmers working their land into their 80s. Sardinian shepherds walking steep terrain as a matter of daily routine. Bolivian forager farmers whose work requires constant bending, carrying, and ground-level activity well into late adulthood. The research on these populations reveals remarkably low rates of the skeletal and metabolic decline that we treat as the default experience of aging in industrialized countries. They are not exceptional people with exceptional genetics. They are ordinary people living in environments that have not yet completed the process of mechanically silencing their bodies. Their longevity is, in large part, an environmental story told through biology. There is a profound irony embedded in the modern relationship with exercise and aging. We have built a civilization that is, in many ways, the most physically comfortable environment any human population has ever inhabited. Controlled temperature, smooth surfaces, mechanized transport, delivered nutrition, ergonomic furniture designed to eliminate physical effort. And in building this extraordinary comfort, we inadvertently eliminated the very inputs our biology requires to maintain itself. What feels like a failure of discipline is often, at its root, a mismatch between your evolutionary biology and the environment you inherited. Name it correctly. Then do something simpler and more durable than forcing yourself into a gym. Give your body something to respond to. It has been waiting longer than you know. In the next episode, I want to explore something that connects directly to what we discussed today, the way the brain itself has evolved to respond to physical engagement and what happens cognitively when that engagement disappears. The connection between muscular load and neurological vitality is one of the most quietly revolutionary findings in evolutionary neuroscience. And I think it will change how you understand the mind as much as the body. If this way of thinking about your body is new to you, subscribe, because the next episode explores something even stranger, how muscle activity shapes the brain itself. That is where the next chapter of this story begins. And I think it will be the most surprising conversation we have had yet.